Okay, so this week we're going to talk about adolescence and emerging adulthood. I'm going to start off by talking about adolescence, and I am going to ask you to forgive me a little bit because I have a lot of slides this week. You can use um, uh, the slides that are posted on the website on uh, um, Blackboard to go ahead and just kind of preview and see what you want to hear about. In adolescence, I'm also going to try to break the topic down into smaller sections. But there's a lot going on in adolescence, and this tends to be one of the age groups that a lot of people are really interested in, not only because of all of the storm and stress as adolescents have been known for, but also because this is when a lot of more chronic um, psychological pathologies or a lot of more chronic pathologies are identified. So let's start off talking about biological changes in adolescence. So we have changes in the endocrine system. These are related to primary sex characteristics that change. This is development in the gonads, as well as development of testes and eggs. Secondary sex characteristics are the stuff that you can see with your clothes on. The ways that we signal gender or sex from externally. And then we have all of the social, cultural, and psychological responses to puberty. There are more of these in the slides that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So you can look to those if you have more, if you're interested in that. And then we'll talk a little bit about biology and the environment, ways that interactions between what adolescents are doing in terms of activity, but also what they're eating may affect biology. Okay, so puberty. This comes from the last Latin word pubescere, which means to grow hairy. So in puberty, we are getting hairy. Also, the endocrine system again, which is responsible for sweat, and particularly the sweat glands that produce oils, which grow bacteria, which make you stinky and need to wear deodorant. We are getting hairy and stinky. Yay, gotta love adolescence. So we're going through lots of big changes in anatomy, physiology, physical appearance in puberty. Puberty we have typically talked about as going on in adolescence, in the teen years, but as we'll talk about in a second, as far as we've been keeping track of puberty, it has been getting younger and younger. So it is kind of ending up in the end of childhood as opposed to in the teen years for a lot of people. Okay, so just a little bit on the endocrine system. We're not going to spend much time here. Just the idea that the leptin in our fat cells stimulates the hypothalamus to create these changes that make a cascade effect in our endocrine system. The hypothalamus increases production of gonadotropin releasing hormone, and this is related to a level of reaching a certain body fat content in your body. This has to do with when people start puberty, right? More body fat earlier, you're likely to start earlier. But also there is a kind of a relationship between the gonads, adrenal glands, and hypothalamus and regulating what all of these hormones are doing and when we start. I call it a cascading effect in that once the process has begun, it is harder to stop. Hypothalamus gets going, this triggers things in the thyroid, the adrenals, and then we are going through puberty. Yes, that's enough for this. So the hypothalamus keeps track of androgens and estrogens in the bloodstream. Um, the pituitary gland responds to the gonadotropin releasing hormone and produces FSH, LH, and ACTH. What this is important for you guys is mostly in case things are not going as expected. Very early or very late puberty, there may be some of these things to look into. And there's a site there at the bottom. It's old, but it still kind of gives a nice overview of what's going on with the endocrine system. The gonads and adrenal glands respond to FSH and LH by changing how much of the sex hormones, androgens, and estrogens they produce. And again, there's this idea of a cascade or a set point when you get a certain amount of sex hormones, and then the hypothalamus is triggered to change the levels of GnRH, and that changes how much sex hormones we're producing. Okay. So we start to see in adolescence the first changes or differences by sex with testosterone and estriadol, which is related to estrogen. So in general, there's a rise in testosterone for both boys and girls towards the beginning of puberty. And then towards the end of puberty, that guys far outpace girls, and girls instead have increase in estradiol. Estradiol. And if you'll notice at the bottom on the x-axis here for both of these graphs, it says pubertal stage. We're talking about Tanner stages. I believe those are covered in the Arnett text. If not, there's a slide about them in the slides that are posted to Blackboard. Okay. Also, there is a relationship between our growth spurt that occurs right before starting puberty and the course of puberty and when we are likely to end our growth spurt. So you can see differences in averages across males and females in terms of when the growth spurts begin, and also when the puberty ends and the final height is achieved. So if you start puberty earlier, you're also likely to stop growing height earlier. Again, there's tons of differences within sex groups here, but these are averages. You start earlier with the growth spurt, you end your height growth earlier. Okay, another part about growth here, and we won't spend too long on this, just that not all parts of us are growing at the same rate. There is asynchronicity in terms of how we are growing during that growth spurt, that our extremities are likely to grow faster, quicker in that stage. So this is my buddy Screech from Saved by the Bell. Pre and post, well, prepubescent, and then as an adult. So you can kind of maybe see a little bit of this gangly look early in adolescence, and then they kind of grow into the length a little later, hopefully. The reason that I point this out is that adolescents are spending so much time at this point trying to figure out who they are and how they fit in this new body, and reacting to other people's reactions to their new bodies and the changes in their bodies. And they're at a particularly awkward phase anyway. And yet we have this asynchronicity with longer extremities to kind of amplify that awkwardness. There's also differences in the distribution of muscle mass and body fat between males and females. The reason to point this out is that these are normative differences that are related to the hormones in our bodies. On the other hand, these are related to these changes between males and females, particularly as we go through puberty, are also related to body image. And in women, as we go through puberty, we tend to, on average, have a drop in body image from prepubescent to post-pubescent. And so some of that may be about body fat increase, which is normative. Okay. This is also a time when we start to worry about and see increases in the rates of obesity. So an example here, and this is from 2004, so it's a bit old. I don't know that I would expect this to be dramatically different because there are no any trends that would be pushing that to be tons different in any of those countries or the United States. So some issues here with obesity and adolescence. One of the things about adolescence is that we often have higher levels of leptin, right? So leptin is related to puberty and to starting the cycle of those hormones. So puberty and obesity are related. But also, adolescents are able to choose more of what they eat, when they eat, and what they do physically than our younger kids. The selection of foods there on your screen are what I had for a regular everyday meal for lunch in high school. That was my lunch in high school. I considered myself quite healthy because I actually had a burrito and a dessert and a Coke, as opposed to chips and a Coke or chips and a dessert and a Coke. I thought I was doing good, but now I look back at that and cringe. So adolescents are making more of these choices. They're not necessarily making good choices, and they're more likely to eat fast food. Adolescents also see a decline in physical activity, maybe spend more time watching TV. Some of this may be about the decline in physical activity and watching TV is because adolescents' circadian rhythms are changing as well as all of these other things with their bodies. They're growing a ton faster, but their circadian rhythms are changing as well. So they want to wake up later and stay up later on average. Which doesn't coincide well with most school schedules. So they're going to be tired. And then when you are tired and stressed, you tend to eat poorly. Your body goes into some cortisol-induced cravings, and you want fats and sugars and salt. And so you are getting into a cycle of eating poorly, which is not very good fuel for your body to do well, and then you're more stressed and then continue to eat poorly. They're also not sleeping well. Dang, love adolescents. They're doing hard. It is hard to be an adolescent. Okay. So we also talk about eating disorders at this point, with these choices of what adolescents are going to eat, and having these options. That we don't necessarily have a whole lot of programs emphasizing healthy eating and understanding the costs and benefits of your food choices for younger teens or children. So they may not be well equipped. Also, particularly for women, there is a normative increase in body fat through puberty. And our society tends to show us pictures of women that have very little body fat. So if the normative thing that your body is wanting to do is to carry more body fat, and you are looking less like or different, having more exposure to or wanting to compare yourself to images on media, this may be a difficult time for eating disorders. And indeed, a lot of eating disorders come up in adolescence. So you see anorexia as well as bulimia. We see these more often in upper and middle socioeconomic classes. Working class or poor communities don't have as many issues with eating disorders as the more well off. Folks who are paying attention more to media particularly media with images of this thin ideal, are more likely to strive for thinness. Um, Folks who have warm and controlling parents, so parents that are giving them good responsiveness as well as some good reasonable levels of control, is a good counteraction for eating disorders. And these eating disorders are most common in young women. Okay, so some stuff that's going on with puberty for males and females. Males, these primary sex characteristics, again, are the ones that we are not likely to see, but are the ones that are related to, most related to reproduction. So development of sex organs for both sexes, for guys, production of sperm, for females, production of eggs. Secondary sex characteristics, skin becomes rougher for both sexes, hair growth for both sexes, sweat glands increase production for both sexes. For females, also the enlargement of breasts. Okay, so advances in how well we make food and feed ourselves and how regularly we do that have made it so that we are growing taller and heavier faster. So kids are healthier. We are less likely to starve in many countries, definitely industrialized countries across the world. And as a result, we are starting to see leptin levels, right? Remember, leptin is in the fat cells, and that was kind of triggering this whole pubertal kind of cascade of events to incite puberty. So we are getting heavier younger and bigger younger. So we have seen, as long as we've been keeping track, a downward kind of slope in the ages at which people start puberty. Generally, that's been easier to read in women because we look at menarche. Menarche would be the first time you have your period. For guys, we look at spermarche. So that's the first time that your ejaculate contains sperm. Since most guys are not at closely examining their ejaculate to see if it has sperm in it, we don't usually take that as that's a harder measure, right, to examine. The other thing, that there's differences in taboos about whether about these two as well. So we usually look at menarche, but rates for men and women are both going down. We also see that puberty begins earlier in places where there's good nutrition and medical care. In the US, the average rate for starting puberty, I think this is 2000, maybe it was 2010, is 12.5. So again, as I said, we're getting into the later childhood, not even into teens. Illness and thinness can inhibit production of body fat. Again, body fat, leptin, delaying puberty, right? So if you are ill or thin or not putting on as much body fat, this may delay puberty. And that might account for some individual differences within a country or community, as well as differences across communities. Okay, so here's tanners. We're not going to spend too much time with this. The only thing to look at here, while tanners research on puberty and the stages that came up with here are used widely, Tanner was looking at a selection of kids from a particular socioeconomic status. So he may have been looking at a particular population and kind of extrapolating to all kids everywhere. You can already see in the ages that we have here that things have already started to move younger since 1970, when he originally did this work. Okay, so cultural responses to puberty. Lots of communities have cultural responses or some sort of tradition related to boys. Some do for women as well. Typically, these rituals have to do with what are often seen as masculine traits. So, displaying courage, strength, endurance. These are often violent, making boys prove themselves, having some kind of life threatening or pain um, uh, part to them. And guys, young boys don't often look forward to these in anticipation, kind of worried about them or dread them. More cultures have puberty rituals for women. Often these are triggered by menarche, first period. And sometimes menstrual blood is seen as an omen that is positive. So you can, uh, because you are now able to be a mother and able to produce offspring, sometimes it's considered a dangerous thing. Okay, so before we go into Piaget, we're going to stop there, and that'll be our first little bit on biological changes in adolescence.